Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the REACH 3030. This welcome would normally be given to you by my colleague Herb Stryker, but today he could not make it, so it will be just myself. Today's topic are PBT and PMTs and endocrine disruptors, the newest developments. And indeed, there are newest developments. Some documents were published early October. I'm Aleš Bartl, and I'm associate in Brussels office of Keller and Heckman, and I've been giving this presentation already for 1 year and a half. Those that are regular to these webinars know me already. So to put this into context, so PBT and PMT and endocrine disruptors are one of the priorities of the chemical strategy for sustainability. As you know, this communication was published in October 2020. And it was just published as an action plan. But in the meantime, the first proposals already materialize. And obviously, we are expecting further proposals in the years to come, with a REACH proposal being scheduled, a REACH amendment proposal being scheduled end 2022 already. We had presentation on this a couple of months ago. So the goals of the strategy is to have toxic-free environment by 2030, and to make the strategy or the proposals emanating from the strategy as a global standard. And I think this is the global standard point is quite relevant to today's topic, because if the EU introduces classification for PBTs, PMTs, and endocrine disruptors, it's likely that in the near future, it may be actually introduced, implemented into JHS. So it may indeed, classification of these groups may become a global standard in the not very distant future. So let's first talk about developments in PBT and PMTs. So just as a short introduction, what is the current status for PBTs and vPvB? So it's persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic, and very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances. Currently, there is an obligation for REACH registrants to carry out a PBT vPvB assessment under Annex 13 REACH. Annex 13 REACH provides numerical criteria for persistent and bioaccumulative endpoints that are coupled with the weight of evidence assessment of screening and assessment data. Normally, if you have data that you can extrapolate directly into numerical criteria, into numerical criteria, you don't usually do the weight of evidence assessment. But this is in general not clear. This is still a bit gray zone. So it's interesting actually that we are now proceeding to classification labeling of PBT without really having clear criteria actually how to identify them in the EU as yet. So if they are identified as PBT or vPvB, the registrants have to minimize exposure and emissions based on exposure estimation. And in addition, PBTs and vPvBs are a group of substances of very high concern. So this is the current situation. But these groups are not a hazard classification as yet. So some operators may classify currently PBTs under one of the environmental hazard classes, but some hazard classes may not fit for specific PBTs or vPvBs, mainly because there is no toxic endpoint. So many of these substances are currently just not classified, and there is no information in the supply chain on their potential properties other than, for example, a safety data sheet, but there is really not a classification, a label on the products. So this will change. This will change. There is already a proposal by the Commission to classify PBTs and vPvBs. The ad hoc meeting of Caracal that was held on 30 September 2021 agreed on criteria for classification of PBTs and vPvBs. It's not an official proposal yet. It's not a commission proposal that will go into legislative procedure. This is really just a proposal for further discussion. So the commission intends to use the existing numerical criteria of Annex 13 as a starting point, and Annex 13 would be deleted from REACH. So the PBT vPvB would only be, the assessment would only be done under CLP. There would only be two categories, PBT and vPvB. There will be no category 2 suspected PBT vPvB. That would be normally based on screening data. That means that if, for example, if a substance is not readily biodegradable, it could be considered as suspected persistent substance. But this was not put forward, this proposal. One of the reasons was that this would simply lead to too many substances being classified as suspected PBT, because based on the Commission survey, about 25% of unextant substances, that means above 1,000 tons, would likely meet the PBT screening criteria. 33 would meet the persistent screening criteria, 47 would meet the bioaccumulative screening criteria, which is quite impressive. And these numbers, I think maybe it's the first time that really someone did this survey. So so this would mean that 25% of all registered substances would be identified as suspected PBT vPvB. On the other hand, if we only have category 1, that means those that are really identified, there is estimate that there are around 400 of all registered substances which may be identified as PBT vPvB. So 400, the Commission expects that 400 substances will be classified PBT vPvB. So the other consideration for PBT and vPvB is that the threshold for classification should be 0.1. And it is proposed to include endocrine disruption to the toxicity part of the PBT rules, because currently the endocrine disruption endpoint is not considered for T point. So this loophole will change. There are open questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Annex 13 assessment of PBT vPvB is not still that straightforward. There is extensive Commission guidance on how to identify substances as PBT vPvB, but it's still not, its application is still not straightforward. It's still not very clear when actually you can rely on weight of evidence assessment, when there is a trigger for higher tier studies, whether you can use QSAR or other adaptation in screening, what is the relevance of screening data in the weight of evidence. So all these questions that are currently handled by Commission guidance, or basically two Commission guidances on CSA. There is a question whether these will continue to apply, whether the Commission will rewrite these guidance documents in order to apply to classification labeling assessment, or whether the Commission will simply annul them or withdraw them. This needs to be seen. In my view, these guidance documents will continue to apply. They will be just put under the CLP umbrella. So this is for PBT vPvB, classification based on current Annex 13 criteria. Now let's go to completely new classification group. Persistent, mobile, and toxic, and very persistent and very mobile substances. Both are quite recent type of substances, identified really some 5 years ago when they were first identified as a group of SVHCs, because they are of similar concern as PBT. And the concern is that they are highly soluble in water and have a low adsorption potential. So they are not impeded in their travels by solids such as sediments. They are thought to be able to travel long distances. A low adsorption potential means that standard water treatment processes do not work. And continuous presence in water is believed to result in continuous bioavailability. So these are the reasons why these substances are of concern, and they should be considered under the same umbrella as PBT, vPvB. The ad hoc meeting on 30 September 2021 brought forward a proposal on criteria how to classify PMT vPvM. So the proposal is that the mobility should be based exclusively on the logarithm of the water to organic carbon partition coefficient. So if this coefficient is between 2 and 3, the substance should be mobile. And if it's below 2, it will be very mobile. Now, important is that these values, and this is very new, this I think really came in last weeks, this change. These two values are lower by 1 than values proposed already years ago by German authority. So these are lower. In other words, less conservative, less stringent than originally proposed by German authority. But industry, in the public consultation and in the stakeholder consultations, industry was advocating rather than just the coefficient, the introduction of coefficient, industry was advocating tiered approach that includes consideration of leachability via modeling and experimental data. But the Commission recently concluded that the criteria should not take into account environmental parameters because very different environmental conditions globally. And that the approach based on leaching is more specific for risk assessment. In other words, when identifying PMT, vPvM substances, the environmental parameters, the risk of the substance, how it behaves in the environment, will not be taken into consideration. It will be just on the modeling, on the laboratory tests, using only the carbon partition coefficient, which may lead to really many substances being actually identified as PMT vPvM. This is just for information. In 2019, the ChemSec, the NGO, already identified several substances that should be considered as PMT based on the German mobility criteria. So as I said now, the criteria are less stringent by 1. So maybe some of these substances would not be considered PMT anymore. But yeah, so there are already some substances identified by NGOs as PMT. Okay, let's talk about endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals which can impact on the hormonal system of humans and animals. Currently, endocrine disruptors are a group of SVHCs. And there are actually many endocrine disruptors already on the candidate list. And the biocidal product regulation and the plant protection product regulation already includes some criteria how to identify endocrine disruptors. But these criteria have been considered as not workable by the institutions and also by industry. And institutions, EU institutions, were of the opinion that it does not lead to identification of endocrine disruptors overall, that there are just two little substances being identified as ED. So there are currently 2 ongoing initiatives with respect to ED. Classification of ED under CLP, similar to PBT, PMT, and specific information requirements for endocrine disruptors endpoints in REACH. So let's look at these 2 initiatives more closely. So the classification of endocrine disruptors. So it is proposed that there will be category 1, known, 1A, or presumed, 1B, endocrine disruptors for human health or for environment. And then category 2, suspected endocrine disruptors, again, for human health or for environment or for both. And the proposed classification criteria have been already laid down in a quite detailed way in this document. If you want to receive a copy of these documents, send me a message and I will send it to you. So this document really provides criteria to identify endocrine disruptors, and it is based on international WHO definitions. But again, it's not an official Commission proposal as yet. This is just still under discussion. Now let's talk about additional REACH requirements for endocrine disruptors. So the chemical strategy for sustainability seeks to ensure that sufficient and appropriate information is made available to authorities to allow the identification of endocrine disruptors. And to do this, the European Commission shall update information requirements to allow the identification of endocrine disruptors in relevant legislation, particularly under REACH. So this dates from 2020, and now this has materialized. So there is a project to update REACH annexes for inclusion of data requirements on endocrine disruptors. There is currently a public consultation that is still open until October 15. So it's still for a couple of days. And it outlines what is in the pipeline. So amendment of Annex 1 REACH with chemical safety assessment, and more importantly, with of Annexes 7 to 10, which provide the REACH data requirements for substances. So if indeed these annexes are amended with additional studies to be carried out, that means that registrants will have to carry out these studies and update their dossiers with the new tests. The public consultation, the ongoing public consultation still takes into consideration several options as outlined already in October 2020, but it looks like the main principles will be as follows of future amendment of annexes. First, there is a proposed 2008 cutoff point for existing data in Annex 11. In other words, data that are older than 2008 will not be taken into consideration for these endpoints. Second principle is that only positive result in Annex 7 in vitro test will be the trigger to conduct appropriate in vivo mechanistic studies in Annexes 8 and higher. Which is good for industry, because that means that you could just use in vitro tests under Annex 7 to waive conducting studies, in vivo studies in higher annexes. But in this respect, the Commission raised concern that the in vitro tests under Annex 7 could bring false positive. That means that the registrants will have to carry out the higher tier in vivo mechanistic studies anyway, because in vitro studies under Annex 7 would bring false positives, which is a bit surprising because one would say that the Commission would be more concerned about false negatives, that you would not carry out a study on a substance that actually is endocrine disruptors. But so it looks like the Commission agrees that in vitro tests would be a trigger for a higher tier studies, and they are not concerned about false negatives. And the document also includes proposed waivers, such as the study TG443 could be a waiver for mechanistic tests. So let's talk about what would be the impact of PBT or endocrine disruptor classification, or PMT. So first, obviously, generation of additional data under REACH will lead to more substances being identified as endocrine disruptors, because currently nothing really forces industry to actively investigate whether the substance has endocrine disrupting properties, and also the criteria currently are not very workable. So there will be more endocrine disruptors being identified, and also obviously more PMTs and potentially maybe also PBTs. So if a substance is classified in these hazard classes, then first you have to notify it to ECHA classification, labeling, and inventory that is publicly available. Of course, you don't notify your name as a registrant. It's anonymous, but the substance will be already known to be endocrine disruptor, for example, if there are many notifications of this classification. But more importantly, there would be potentially automatic phase out for professional and consumer uses based on the revision of the generic approach to risk assessment as envisaged by the chemical strategy for sustainability. The revision of generic approach to risk management is also one of the cornerstones of the strategy. That means that substances that are identified in these hazard classes would be phased out without taking into account risk or exposure. This is a generic phase out of these substances, and not only for consumer uses, because currently under REACH, for example, CMRs are quasi-automatically phased out from consumer uses. But after the extension of this approach, it would also be phased out for professional uses, which means basically for all uses. Basically, identification of a substance as ED, PBT, or PMT could in the future lead to an end of marketing. But of course, this concept of generic approach to risk assessment, generic phase out, will be subject to exemption for essential uses. So it will not apply absolutely. There will always be a possibility to claim that your use at hand is essential. And now the Commission has been already for a year working on how to identify essential uses based on the most recent information that the Commission announced, is that the Commission is currently working, or the Commission is working with their external consultant on a study how the essential uses should be defined. So we are really still at a very early stage of defining essential uses. But it would appear that in addition, obviously, to essential use of being necessary for human health, the essential use concept may also include some Green Deal arguments, such as that your substance is necessary for for sustainability, for energy consumption, for circular economy criteria. So really, the Green Deal arguments could in the future work for you to use the essential use exemption. And of course, the question is whether the generic approach to risk assessment will also apply to category 2 endocrine disruptors, suspected endocrine disruptors. Probably not, probably not. So that's it. Just maybe for the final thoughts, it's really necessary that you follow the developments. Unfortunately, the Commission does not have a very good website on chemical strategy for sustainability. They have just maybe most relevant documents published there, but all these Caracal documents or other working documents with discussions are not included on this website. So really, we have to dig. We have to dig, and it's necessary that you keep track and that you contribute to public consultations, because the European institutions, and it doesn't apply only to PBT or endocrine disruptors. It applies overall in this revision of REACH and CLP. The Commission needs input and needs to receive some boundaries to their efforts. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to welcoming you in next REACH 3030 that will take place in November. Thank you and goodbye.